What was your highest rank?
Corporal.
Can you tell me where you served?
Yes, in the States, and we were in New Zealand for a short time. We were in Tulagi, Guadalcanal, and the Southern Solomons. In that landing, the initial landing and following campaign. Australia, New Guinea Hospital in Milne Bay, and the landing and following campaign at Cape Gloucester, New Britain.
Ted, were you drafted or did you enlist?
No, I enlisted 6 months before the war, enlisted in July of 41. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about someone having to get their parents' signature at age 17. And that's exactly what happened to me. I graduated from high school in June of 41. And my brother had just enlisted in the Marine Corps. And not to be outdone, because I was always competing with him. He was older, stronger, brighter, superior in most ways. I had nothing to do, no job, no skill. I got out of high school, I think, really as a social promotion. It was a time of the national emergency. And when I brought the papers home that I picked up at the post office in Hartford and brought them to my mother, she looked very stern and kind of sad, and she said, "You'd have to see your father on that." So I went into the backyard, and it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. My father was a milkman, had his own business in Manchester. Milkmen worked from 3 in the morning to 3 or 4 in the afternoon. That's when the milk had to be on the doorstep for the workers at 6 to 7 to 8 in the morning. And he said to me, when I asked him to sign, "There's going to be a war, you know." And I thought he was off his track and said, "No, there's not going to be any war. I just want to go and see the world." I could see those sandwich boards, you know, with the Marine Corps uniform and all that stuff, and the names of China and other worldly places. And he said again, "You really want to go?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Then I'll sign." And he did. 6 months later, we were in, it was in December, of course, of 41. And I was at a place called Navy Pier in Chicago, beginning to set up a metalsmithing school. And the war came. And all my life I've thought of his remarks. There's going to be a war, you know. Here was a man who didn't go beyond 8th grade. But he read the papers from cover to cover. And now as I read history and see what was going on in 40 and 41, I know where he was coming from. but I keep hearing those words, and I heard them when we heard that there was going to be a war on December. We heard that the Japanese, heard the radio saying that Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor.
So Ted, where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor? In Chicago?
Yeah, it was
Do you remember the moment you heard it?
I do. People had set up, the USO had set up tables outside the entrance to this cavernous, huge pier that was stripped naked for the Navy to set up these schools, and they had invited us that Sunday. I got an invite to dinner. So I grabbed the L and went out. I can remember, I don't remember where it was, Cicero, Skokie, wherever. And got off the L and went to this home. It was a bungalow type home, and there was a lot of wood paneling in it, and the people were very pleasant, and there was a lovely girl there. Isn't it crazy? I can remember she was wearing a print dress. So we were about to have dinner, and there was and the radio, a small radio, was on the mantle of the fireplace, and it was about 12:30 or 1 o'clock, and the announcer said, interrupted the program, that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and that all service personnel should report to their base. So I left, and she walked me to the station, the L station. I can remember that. I can't remember her face. I can guess at it, but and on the way back to Navy Pier, and it was a long ride, I recall an old woman selling newspapers at one of the station stops along the way, and literally screaming, war, Pearl Harbor bombed, war. Those things, they really stay with you.
Why did you select the Marine Corps when you enlisted?
Because my brother went there. I didn't want to be outdone, you see.
Where were you living at the time you enlisted?
Pardon?
Where were you living at the time you enlisted?
At home,
Manchester,
in Manchester.
Connecticut?
Yeah, I've always lived here.
After you enlisted, where did you go for your basic training?
To Paris Island.
And can you recall what that was like?
Oh boy. It was infamous agony. And honestly, I felt that I had achieved when that training was over.
How long did the training last?
Then it lasted 2 months. 2 months to 10 weeks, something like that.
And what kinds of things did they train you?
They trained you to believe in the ability and the pride of the Marine Corps, and they pushed you extremely hard physically and beat upon you mentally. And the kind of thing is, you know, give your, and this is no bull, give your heart and soul to God, because your ass belongs to me. That was the first. That was the DI's attitude.
Do you remember
Forget
any
the
of
your umbilical cord is gone, lad.
Do you
And
remember any of your instructors?
yes, I do. And you know, when it was all over, we chipped in and bought the DI, who was feared and loathed, but respected,
What was his name?
a watch. I don't know his name. I don't remember his name. I have a picture somewhere of that recruit platoon.
Oh, great.
I'll try to get it. I just know one incident, and it shows you the kind of thing. It was, the DI had been describing the early Marine Corps and Independence Day and all this stuff about what the Marines had even done in the Revolutionary War. And there was one guy in the platoon who was a little smaller than me, only one. And he was from Tennessee, and his name was Paradise Cole. And the DI liked to needle us a little bit and push us a little bit because we were so small. And he stood in front of Cole, who somehow was grinned while he was talking, and he asked Cole, "What's your name?" And the recruit said, "Paradise Cole." And he said, "When were you born, Paradise Cole?" And the recruit said, as seriously as one can, "July 4th, 1776. He was so, and it expressed the fear that was in many of us of this guy who looked like a Cardiff giant, the drill instructor.
Where did you go after you graduated from basic?
To Quantico for about a month, and then out to Chicago to Navy Pier, as I had indicated.
What did you do for the month you were at Quantico?
I just hung around and picked up cigarette butts.
Fun. Now, when they sent you to Navy Pier in Chicago, what were your duties there?
We were setting up a tin knocker metalsmithing school. However, we were the first troops there. And the first thing we did was set up our own bunks. And really, and then we began to bring in machines and place them where the organizers wanted them. We were the forerunners of a big metalsmithing school. And when the war came, you see, I didn't know. I knew far less then than I know now, which is true and isn't hard to imagine. But I asked for a transfer to the Fleet Marine Force.
When?
I didn't want immediately, the next day after Pearl Harbor. I didn't want to miss the war, you see. I didn't want to go to school. It was a marvelous opportunity to learn a trade, welding, metalsmithing. But I asked for the transfer because I didn't want to miss the war. Because I didn't know.
Did they grant you the transfer?
And immediately got the transfer and was shipped down to the end of December to, it was at that time called Tent City, New River Marine Base, Jacksonville, North Carolina. That grew into the massive Camp Lejeune. It was a very cold winter in North Carolina, in the winter of 42, and we lived in tents.
They didn't even have barracks at that time?
No, they didn't.
How long did you spend at Camp Lejeune?
Until May, training. And then we boarded ship. We went to Norfolk, boarded ship. The first, let's see, I was assigned to the 5th Regiment. The 1st and the 5th Regiments. And the 11th, that was the Artillery Regiment. We boarded the converted United States liner. It was now named the Wakefield, and set sail down the East Coast through the Panama Canal to Wellington, New Zealand. And we arrived in Wellington, New Zealand in the early days of June. We did not know that we had arrived in Wellington after 30-some days at sea, running alone this huge transport with about 7,500 men on it. That the Battle of Midway had taken place a few days before our arrival in Wellington, New Zealand. And we were encamped there. Oh, there's something worth telling. When we went by train from Wellington after debarking to a camp about 40 miles away. Beautiful little camp had a native name. It was called Paikakariki. And it also had a Christian name, McKay's Crossing, English name rather. When we disembarked on the concrete platform, there were many, many local people standing around, so many. They were crying. Look, you could see the tears, and we felt uneasy. Why was this? And there were old men with chauffeurs' caps on, or Greek-like fishing caps on, and they were crying. And one woman I can remember held up her baby and several of them said, "Thank God you've come." And we were uneasy because we didn't know. You see, we didn't know that the Japanese had broadcast that was, of course, directed toward New Zealand and Australia, that told the New Zealanders what would happen when they occupied them or they were within their sphere. That the men would be sent to South Island and that the women would stay in North Island where agriculture would be primary and manufacturing would be in the South. I didn't know that for 50 years until I read some account. I can understand why the women cried and the men, and they held up their children, but we didn't know at the time. We didn't know anything. It was not like Hollywood, where you're gathered together and there are dioramas and all this other stuff. It was very, at least at that time, there was very, very little. Things were moving awful fast, quickly. Changes.
Ted, what were you trained to do? What was your job?
I was a infantryman. I was a BAR man, Browning automatic rifle.
And where did you receive your training in the BAR?
At Tent City,
Oh.
New River Marine Base.
What do you remember about that weapon? Can you describe that a little bit to me?
Well, it was, with the bipod, it weighed 21 pounds, I think. I think they gave it to me as they did. That was a Marine's way. They would give a heavy weapon to a small guy to see if he could stand it. That's at least my take on it. Because, and at that time, listen, we went to war at that time with the same weapons that were used in World War I. The BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, the troops, the Marine infantry had the bolt action 1903 Springfield rifle, and these were weapons that came out of the Spanish-American War. I can remember on the landing on August 7th on Tulagi, that the machine guns in the on the Higgins boat that we went in on were Lewis guns. They came out of Snoopy in World War I from the British de Havillands. It was anyway, we stayed there at this camp, and it was a beautiful place, like the Berkshire Hills. And
Were there barracks or you slept in tents?
they were, the New Zealanders had constructed these little two-man huts, is what they were. It was nice quarters.
How long did you stay there?
About a month, and then we were moved quickly to a month, 6 weeks, to Wellington. The New Zealand dock workers were on strike. Of course, we didn't know why we were unloading all of these transports that had come from the U.S. They were all loaded back-asswards. So they had to take everything off of them and reload it, combat loaded. And because the New Zealand dock workers were on strike, the troops had to do it. They were working, and it was cold. That's their winter, wet. And we were working around the clock. We didn't know that there was a landing planned at the end of July that was then boosted forward a week or two to August 7th in the Lower Solomons, on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo, Florida, Maleta. I may not even be pronouncing some of those places right.
When did you ship out of New Zealand?
It must have been about the middle of July.
What was your first stop?
We had a practice landing in the Fiji Islands that was a bust. Some of the boats swamped, got hung up on coral, but it was done.
Did you, at that point, have any idea of where you was?
No,
You were
we were,
headed?
no, we did not. And I know that we were told at one point, I think after the after the practice landing at Fiji, that we were going to a place we couldn't even pronounce it, Guadalcanal, Tulagi. We didn't know it.
Was Guadalcanal your first combat experience?
Actually, we landed on Tulagi.
First?
The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment landed on Tulagi as backup to Colonel Edson's 2nd Raider Battalion, and he also had the 1st Paratroop Battalion. They were part of Edson's Raiders. They never jumped, but they got the hell beat out of them along with the Raiders, and were evacuated from Guadalcanal about the middle of I think about the middle of October.
So you were on Tulagi waiting to be replacements for
No,
Guadalcanal?
we went on Tulagi, and that island was secured within a week. There was some bad, heavy fighting there, and
Was your unit involved in that fighting, or was that before you landed?
no, we landed a couple hours behind the Raiders, and we backed up the Raiders. We had a little fighting there. I want to tell you a story about the humanity that is shown by some people in war and in very unusual ways. We landed on August 7th. On the night of August 7th, on the end of the island, the northwest, that we had was jungle covered, that we had been assigned to clean out. We didn't find any Japanese there. The Raiders and the Raiders were heavily involved with the Japanese. That night we were enveloped with fear. It was the first night in the jungle. It just grabbed you and settled in your groin, and I think we shot 2 or 3 of our own people that night. And when we came up out of the jungle on the ridge that bisected the island and into the brilliant light the next morning, about, say, 8 o'clock, whatever the time was, 7:30, 8 o'clock, we could see from that point on the ridge the whole operation. To the right, about 20 miles away, there was the line of Guadalcanal, the large island. Between Tulagi and other larger islands off to the north, there was about 20 miles of ocean called the Sea Lark Channel, or Indispensable Straits. And there lay the whole invasion fleet. And you could see the Higgins boats and the tank lighters. It was all, they were like toys, but you could see the wakes, the white water behind them as they were moving away from the carrying troops into Guadalcanal and supplies. For the landing had been made there on August 7th as well. That was the main object. That's where the airfield was. And off to the left, was a Tulagi harbor that was a very deep, small, very deep harbor formed by Tulagi and the island of Florida immediately to its north. And warehouses and other outbuildings were burning, and oil stores were burning, and there was black and brownish smoke everywhere. And ahead of us was you could see a cut in this ridge on which we stood that would have taken one from the southern part of the island to the northern part, bilateral, a deep cut. And you could see caves in this cut from where we stood looking to the east. And immediately to our right, as close as you're sitting to me, what had been the High Commissioner's home, the High Commissioner of the Solomon Islands. And it was destroyed, blown apart by shelling. And there were a lot of shell cases on the trail, on this ridge where we stood. And it made us uncomfortable because they rolled beneath your feet, and kicking them out of the way. And as you kicked them, you noticed there was a lot of dried blood on the ground. So there had been a hell of a fight there that night before. And you could hear the firing of the machine guns, the ahead of you, the whacks of the rifle, the whump of the mortars, and the cordite and the wood smoke and the burning smoke from oil stung your nostrils. And suddenly, two SBDs, Scout Bomber Douglas, workhorse airplane, came in from the south, very low, and the pilot and the gunners waved to us. We were all in line, you see, on this ridge. Halted. The fighting was going on to our east, a few hundred yards. And they dropped bombs and created these huge, beautiful, concentric smoke rings. And you know what I thought of? I was a big fan of the big bands. And there was a big band leader who was kind of a clown. He was called Ben Burney, and he smoked cigars while he was directing and would blow smoke rings. And suddenly, and ahead of us, just about a mile, there were these tiny islands, and they were named Gavutu and Tanambogo. And there was a landing going on there then. And a destroyer was offshore, and a whoomp, 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 the flash of the guns and firing onto the island. You could see where they were hitting, and the troops going in, the boats going in behind them. All of this disharmony and chaos of war. And a guy got out of the line of us, and he walked over, and suddenly I realized, as close as that wall, there was a piano alongside between us in file and the shattered resonant. And one of its legs, the right foot had been shot off, so it canted to the right. And this fellow came out of line, kind of smiling, and he got up to the piano, and I can still see him because his weapon was shouldered, and he pitched his body to line up with the keyboard, and he played. All that hellishness going on. And he played, "You may not be an angel, for angels are so few. But until the day that one comes along, I'll string along with you." A song that was popular in the 30s. I just found out who wrote it. Someone got the words and the author and its origin for me. And he played it again. And you could hear the notes in between. And then he kind of smiled. I could see him, he was almost smiling to himself. And he went back in line. I never saw him before because we were kind of mixed up in platoons, companies, coming up out of the jungle, and we were waiting there. And then a short time later, never saw him before, but I thought to myself, or think today, the humanity of it, with that, all of that going on. The planes, the ships, the shelling, the action going on ahead of us on the ground. The whole thing spread out. The smoke, the cordite.
Wow.
You may not be an angel.
After he played and they got back in line, did you then go into battle?
Yeah, the sergeant came up and said, "All right, we're going in on the left of the raiders to give them a hand. We're going to clean out those shacks and those buildings
What were you
along the
thinking at
harbor."
that time? Because that was your first taste of combat. Do you remember what you were thinking?
I hoped I could manage the fear. Yep. We were there for 2 weeks, and no, about 10 days, and then we went over to Guadalcanal, and were there for the whole 4 months. See, we took that island, and they had built an airfield there.
You're talking about Tulagi or Guadalcanal?
Guadalcanal. Tulagi was...
Finish up with Tulagi and then tell me in detail about Guadalcanal. So after you helped the raiders out, how long did that battle last, would you say?
Well, the raiders really and the paratroopers secured that island in, 2-3 days.
Did you immediately go after these couple
No,
days to
we
Guadalcanal?
were there for another week. After we were there for a week, we were allowed to go swimming, to take a bath. Somebody got some sand soap, so we stacked arms and put our folded our clothes and left them, and there we were allowed to go in about a squad at a time, so you had 8 or 9 naked guys so glad in the water. And then to our right that day, about 100 yards, it seemed even closer, a Japanese submarine surfaced. These are the weird kind of things that never make the record books. God damn, there's one of our subs, one of the fellows cried. Then there was a moment of silence, and another guy said, "Bullshit, look at the writing." And it was Japanese.
So what happened?
I wish they could have I wish somebody had had a camera taken a picture of us running, understand,
Once you
naked and
realized
scared,
Japanese.
and yes, and grabbing our clothes and our weapons and making for any shelter whatsoever that we could. And then, as I remember, the mortar platoon, I think, blanketed somewhere from mortars fired from that island, some position, it seems to me, and blanketed that submarine, and all of a sudden it was slipping beneath the water. It had surfaced and obviously seen that the island was no more occupied by Japanese. It went away. And the next day we were in holes along the beach, and it was early morning, and we were two to a hole, and there was a channel between the eastern end of Tulagi and the next island in the group called Florida. And the channel was very deep, the harbor was deep. That's where our PT boats were tied up, where they were based later on in that long campaign. And we looked off to the right, and this beautiful, beautiful destroyer was coming. And again, we said, one of our destroyers. Then all of a sudden we realized it wasn't, because the flag flapping from the fantail was the rising sun. She came in, beautiful, silent except the throb of her engines. Swung through the channel and into the harbor, and then she began to fire. You could hear those shells. What float planes of ours were on the water in the harbor, she destroyed, and she fired a few rounds into the buildings along the shoreline, and then turned. And when she came back out, the Japanese sailors in their whites were all over the deck. They were thumbing their nose at us. No, just by the fact that they were on deck doing their duty. No fear. Nobody was firing at them. They knew that. If they had had the force ready, they could have they might have retaken things. We had taken the island. They wanted it back. None of us knew. We couldn't even pronounce the name Guadalcanal at the time. We went over one night. I can't remember getting aboard this old cut-down destroyer. A sailor came to me with a can of peaches. Can you imagine that? A sailor gave me a can of peaches. He opened it up for me. And he gave me a toothbrush and a comb and I think some toothpaste. And a can of peaches, because we had lived on Tulagi on, we had only had a day's rations when we went ashore there. So we lived on coconuts and stolen Japanese rice, recovered Japanese rice. Gave me those peaches, big can of peaches and that syrup. It was champagne. Beautiful that guy was.
Now, when you boarded that ship, were you on your way to Guadalcanal?
Yeah, we went across the
Did
straits.
you know that's where you were going?
Oh yes, we
So
knew
you
then.
You were going right into another battle?
Yes.
Now you were a seasoned combat veteran. Did it feel any different going into Guadalcanal?
No, there was always fear, if that's really what you're asking. No, it didn't. It didn't. We, at that time, we didn't. The fear was always there. The knack of a good soldier is to manage it, to learn to manage it.
Well, you had been tested at Tulagi and you made it through, so did you feel more confident that you were going to be able to handle that fear?
No, not necessarily. It took another more personal and testing experience. When I lost a mate and he should not have died, he was in my place in the line, and that happened on the Matanuca River in early September, and that stays with you as long as you're around. But that experience made me into a much better Marine and made it possible for me to better manage the difficulties.
Well then, Ted, can you describe the landing at Guadalcanal?
Oh, we just, see that, we went across, I guess it was the 17th, 18th, 19th of August from Tulagi to Guadalcanal. And that island they had already made what was our lodgment there for 4 months. It was about 6 miles long and at its greatest, and it was kind of in a radius. At its deepest into the island, I'd guess it was about 2 miles. It was anchored on the east by a river and on the west by a river. And that's where we were, 6 miles long along the beach, perhaps at its greatest depth 2 miles inland from the beach, kind of in a radius, like a bit of a moon sliver. And that was carved out in the first few days while we were on Tulagi. That's what they had achieved on Guadalcanal. And within that lodgment was the airfield. And that's what that campaign was all about. It was after with years in reading, that airfield, if the Japanese had been allowed, see, that whole thing was just cobbled together. And an example of that was having to unload the ships at Wellington because they had been loaded in reverse for the landing, to show how it was all cobbled together. The practice landing at Fiji was a disaster, but we went ahead with it anyway. I mean, they had to go, because if that airfield had been allowed to operate by the Japanese, they would have been able to have their planes across the supply lines from the U.S. to Australia. They would have been able to cut the supply lines, even to New Zealand. And it would have given them a great staging area to move even further south to Samoa, to Caledonia, New Hebrides, Samoa, Fiji. We were really hanging by a thread in the Pacific at that time. Never realized it, and I don't think that many people did. So we took the airfield, and they wanted it back bad, and they came for it. And that's why they came by air and sea and land, and that's why that campaign was so much for a long time was like a siege. They moved troops into Guadalcanal by the thousands, so that at one time, I think about middle of October to end of October, we had about 20,000 people there, and they had about 25,000. They were overextended. And our Navy recovered so much. There's another part of this story. I had a brother on the heavy cruiser Vincennes. The heavy cruiser Vincennes was part of the invasion fleet. I didn't know it. On the night of August 9th, we were on Tulagi. The main landing on Guadalcanal had been successful. They had taken the airfield. It was a surprise. The few Japanese troops there fled into the jungle. The Japanese came down what was called the slot from Rabaul. They were headed by an admiral who was brilliant, named Mikawa. He came down with 7 ships. To attack the landing. The piece of ocean between Tulagi, Florida islands, Malaysia, others, is about 20 miles, and Guadalcanal to the south is about 20 miles wide. At the entrance to this 20-mile wide sound, you might call it, there was a small island like the cap of a bottle called Savo. Thus, the tragic, for us, naval battle of August 9th, called the Battle of Savo Island. We had 4 heavy cruisers, the Quincy, the Astoria, the Vincennes, and the Australian cruiser Canberra, on patrol at the entrance to this sound of water, this 20-mile wide, where all of the invasion fleet that had discharged some, not all of its people, not all of its landing force yet, and certainly not much of its supplies. So Makawa came down to do them harm, and he ran into the first to get into the Sound, he ran into these 4 cruisers. And it all began about 12:30, and we were on Tulagi and looked over our right shoulders to the west through the rain squalls and saw the greatest firework display that one has ever seen. Ships blowing up, searchlights on, the flash of guns, fire in the ocean. He caught the American cruisers, that's 4 of them, plus the heavy cruiser Chicago, plus 2 or 3 destroyers, at complete surprise. And in an hour and a half, had sunk 4 of them. About 1,500 American sailors died that night. I think. Probably an equal number were wounded. And we saw it all. I mean, we saw it from 15 miles away, 10 miles, you'd see this huge, just satanic kind of fire on the ocean. And we thought that the U.S. Navy, of course, was kicking their ass. And we did not know until about September 10th or so. One of our people was at where the bulletin board was, or the tack board for division headquarters, and came back to our area where we were emplaced and said, we lost that sea battle. We lost 4 cruisers, the 5th with its bow blown off, several destroyers.
Did you realize that it was your brother's
No,
cruiser?
I did not.
When did you find that out?
Well, I knew when the word came back that the Vincennes was one of them, and I thought he was dead. He survived. He was picked up in the water, and I recently found out what destroyer picked him up the next day. So, and he thought that I was gone because I was there on the island. And I thought he was gone. And 1 week before Christmas in 1942, as fate would have it, he recovered from his wounds and he was put aboard a submarine tender called the Fulton that was tied up in the Brisbane River. That was our northernmost base for submarines. That's how bad it was. Brisbane, northeastern Australia. We had been evacuated from Guadalcanal, relieved by the Army, and put in a wet, stinking, hot camp there just west of Brisbane. And I'll be damned, a corpsman came back from having liberty in Brisbane and said that there'd been a fight in a pub where he was, and he found one guy's name was Cummings. His first name was Edwin. I'll be goddamned, it was my brother. Can you imagine the humanity of war? The humanity.
That was the first that the 2 of you knew that each other was alive?
Yep, and so I got to leave. Not only that, I had to hitchhike a ride. Officers were all in Brisbane. There were women, there was booze, there was fun and games. The enlisted men were out in this god-awful camp. because it was hot, and we had malaria. Everybody had malaria. It was like a common cold, but with some it was bad. So I got this word from the corpsman, and I went to the Fulton, the ship, the Fulton, that was tied up in the Brisbane River, and we met. And sent cables home to our mother and father. And he was married. He did not tell them when he signed up that he was married, or they might not have taken him. Anyway, he didn't tell them. But he sent a cable to his wife. And we had, let's see, I got a few days off, 5 or 6. I can't remember any of it except just a few, because I was sick as hell, and I drank a ton, and it just made, between being the alcohol and malaria, they don't mix. So I was out of it. I don't remember.
But you got to spend those days with your brother.
I did.
Did your parents think that you both had died? What did they know?
I'm sure that was in their mind.
Wow, that's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. But there are some... A friend of mine who was a corpsman in the old breed, too, went through some other awful landings in the Pacific that were so little known. A place called Peleliu. So very few people knew about it when it happened. So who the hell is going to know about it when it's over? And 70 years have passed. And then on to Okinawa. And he met his brother on the field at Okinawa, this corpsman did, who just died. His name was Bert Cooper. And he'd cry often because I think he took his work very seriously. And I think he had held his share of men as they died. And he'd break down sometimes when we went together to these meetings that I told you about, that this fellow who is now, years and years ago, there were only 6 or 7 of us, and there were some personal descriptions of events that would come out. I think that a lot of men well, that's why I admire what you're doing so much, because I think that there are many who want to unload. I think that some of the stuff is, it has a different impact upon everybody because we're all different, but I think it's like a boiler with no relief valve. And that's why you're providing the relief valve. You're doing even more than you know.
Ted, go back to Guadalcanal, and after you had actually witnessed the battle that sunk your brother's ship, well, you didn't know it at the time, what transpired after that, and how long did you stay on Guadalcanal?
Until about December 10th to 15th, where we were relieved. We were there 4 months. I'll tell you an experience, and then I'll have to go. But this is what it was like there. In the first place, it was a deceit. When we came round Cape Esperance, before the task force split and we went to Tulagi, and the main force moved to the east toward Guadalcanal, you looked at that island and it was beautiful. The ridges that were running the length of it seemed smooth and rounded. It was like a deceptive man or woman with beautiful form and color. Once we were there, it was the most diseased place on earth, I think. Everything rotted, including your body. If the flies were relentless, the mosquitoes were a terror, and the heat and rain were constant. Every scratch became on the surface unless treated, and there wasn't treatment. The troops of the line in place or in reserve, constantly moving, patrols, constantly moving, and everything rotting. Jungle rot was the order of the day. That's like having athlete's foot or crotch itch magnified by 10 times. Every scratch was infected unless it was, malaria there was of great proportions. We didn't have the quinine. I'm not sure, except somebody else had the market cornered because we didn't have quinine. There was a malarial suppressant that was used called Adabrin. That was a little yellow pill. And because the old wives' tale was that it would make you sterile, we wouldn't take it, we'd spit it out until...
So you all got malaria?
Yeah. But finally we had to take it, and you got malaria anyway. We would take it because the corpsman would literally stand over you and throw it in your mouth if that was possible, or watch you swallow it. But that was, that was an old, that was just backyard gossip. It didn't make you sterile, but it was a deceitful place. On Friday the 13th, October 13th, Friday, 1942, we were in Division Reserve, and we were bivouacked in the coconut grove. There were beautiful coconut groves there. They were owned by Lever Brothers. And BP is familiar initials, isn't it? Burns Phillips. They also owned the coconut groves, and they were extremely big in inter-island trading, and the ships that did inter-island trading of merchandise, of supplies. So we were there in the coconut grove, just a little bit north of the airfield, Henderson Field. Midnight. Two of us had the 12 to 4 watch. he was on one, we were standing, he was on one side, my mate was on, or the guy I was the mate to was on one side of the coconut tree, back up against it, and I was on the other side, and we were on watch over our sleeping mates. Suddenly there was midnight, 12:30 actually. No, 1:30. Suddenly there was a flash to the north, out at sea. I said, holy Jesus, what is that? And it came in, and it came in, whatever it was, the first one. It was truly like an express train. I said, holy Jesus, they're shelling from the sea again. We're getting that all the time. But this was huge. The flash and the sound of that thing coming in. We screamed, condition red, everybody in your hold. For the next hour and a half, 2 Japanese battleships, the Congo and the Haruna, cruised in line and bombarded the airfield. It was a prelude to a Japanese land offensive. They threw in 900 and some shells in an hour and a half. You do the arithmetic, and that means 1 shell every 6 seconds. Every 6 seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were 14-inch shells. It was the night of the sizzling, the night of the buzzing. The buzzing and the sizzling came from the shrapnel that, just cleaved the air. Sizzling. Hour and a half. Some of the rounds fell short so that they didn't all make the airfield, and we were to the north of the airfield. At one point, it seemed to be over, and we poked our heads up out of the holes. You looked toward the airfield, and it was all flame, planes burning, fuel burning, men burning, tents burning, everything. Then it started again. It's just that they had reached their easternmost point and were turned and coming back. Jesus. Not many reporters stayed for any time there because there was nothing of interest for them there. And if that wasn't enough, an hour and a half and they were gone, and that would have meant, 1:30, 3 o'clock. A couple of hours later, 3 Japanese cruisers came in, and in an hour threw in 1,500 more. These were assorted shells, 4, 6, 8-inch, because the main armament on cruisers is 8-inch. But that's the kind of thing. Bombing, shelling, always moving, looking for them and they looking for us. Often wet, dirty. God damn it, war is an unpleasant thing to be involved in. When you think what these guys are going through now, they're all volunteers too. And I'm ashamed. Because the country should be, if we're gonna be everybody's cop, And if we're going to have wars of adventure such as we had in Iraq, to really get oil, that's what it was all about, and be dominant there, under cover of getting rid of a tyrant, Hussein, then the country ought to be behind it. The country ought to be as involved in those wars, carried on by... And then you wonder how long they would be going on. But there isn't any of that. And I feel that we're taking... You can say, well, those men and women volunteered for it.
Ted, I know you have to get back to work, and this might be a good breaking point. We'll end at Guadalcanal, and then we'll resume at another time, if that's okay with you.